Good morning. My name is Cody, if you don't know me already. I love Jesus, I love you, and I'm also going to sit up here and pretend like I'm going to use this chair like Pastor Jeremy did last week. We'll see how long I stay in it. But good morning. So last week, Pastor Jeremy began a sermon series entitled, remind me what it is one more time. It's not a mistake. It's not a mistake. And so we're going to continue today, and really I'm just going to jump right in. We're going to be in Judges chapter 6 is where we're going to finish Judges chapter 6, and then we're going to pick up in Judges chapter 7. But if we can, I would just like to pray quickly, and then we will get started. Dear God, thank you for today. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for this room full of people who came here with the intention to seek your face, to draw closer to you today, and to leave differently than we walked in. In Jesus' name, amen. So let me encourage you as we begin to sit, and it was such a beautiful phrase that Jerry used, and I actually had it written down because I wanted to ask all of us to do this, because we very often say that we set our minds on something, and we think about a thing in order to instill it inside of us. But what we really have to do is set our hearts on something. And so as you're there today listening to what hopefully this message that God has given me that I'm going to do my very best to handle with utmost care, set your heart on this. Because somebody that's just recently been introduced into my life, she was telling me her experience with Jesus. And she said, when the student is ready, the teacher will show up. And that we see that very often in the New Testament as Jesus is teaching parables to his disciples and all the other followers who came along and connected with him. He would use situations from their everyday life. He would use things that they were familiar with, and we call them parables. We should expect Jesus to still do the same thing. If you're not out in your garden working in a vineyard or dealing with these types of scenarios that we read in the New Testament, well then guess what God is going to use to teach you? He's going to use things in your everyday life if you're open to that. If your heart is set on learning, if your heart is ready to be taught, then the teacher will show up. And this has happened to me so many times over the past few weeks, and I've just seen it time and time again. The Holy Spirit shows me and he educates me, and it's through everyday situations that I'm walking in, and I'm open to that, and so he uses those chances to do that. So let me encourage you to do that again today, because look, we're in the Old Testament, and I don't know if any of y'all have read the Old Testament, but sometimes it seems a little bit foreign. It seems like something very removed from us. So what I will try my best to do is bring the context to you now, in where you stand, where you sit, so that these messages can be applied to your heart. So, Gideon. As we ended last week, Gideon had just been called by the Lord to do a very, very big thing. The Lord had shown up in his life. He found him in the wine press, and he told him that he wanted him to deliver the people of Israel from the oppression of the Midianites. Now, a very important thing that I think we need to make sure we see is the very particular type of oppression that the Midianites decided to do against the Israelites. They didn't enslave them. They didn't make them work for them like the Egyptians did. They basically let them live their life. And then when harvest time came around, when all of the fruits of their labor began to pop up, that's when the Midianites popped up as well. The Israelites actually compared them to locusts, because that's what locusts do. They just show up and they just took the fruits of their labor. This is what the Lord is trying to get Gideon to deliver the Israelites from. Now think about your own life. Are you working hard for things? Do you see fruit being produced in your life to only find the enemy come and he's letting you live your life? You're not under constant bondage or oppression. You're basically doing what you want to do, and then good things start happening, and you see the enemy swoop in and take them. This is what the Israelites are experiencing. This is what God is trying to get Gideon to lead them out of. Now, The reason we're talking about Gideon, the reason he is a focal point of not only the Old Testament but this sermon series, is because Gideon was not perfect. He was far from it. As a matter of fact, he was one of the least likely, if we as humans just look at his life and his characteristics, he's not a valiant warrior. He is not the guy that you would pick to say, hey, do this grand thing. But it's who God chose to use. We very often will find ourselves in the exact opposite position than we think we should be, because that's the form of God's kingdom, is to use exactly what the world would think is foolish and then prove them all wrong. And so this is where we are today. I'm gonna encourage you to kind of take the lid off of your life and look down inside of it and be honest about where you are and kind of what's going on inside of you. Because I don't know if y'all know this or not, but we are in the middle of a war. If you're here in this room right now, then likely you've already decided to sign up to fight for one side, right? You've already decided that you in some way are going to be a part of building God's kingdom. But it's not easy, because look, this is a very hard walk. This is a hard walk for us, for Christians who have the Holy Spirit, who have this example in front of us. Imagine what it's like for people. Look, it's very easy. Once you get presented with the gospel, it's very easy to pick heaven over hell. But what is not so easy is to pick heaven over earth, because we have to make choices every single day that says, I'm going to live in a holy manner. I'm going to pursue righteousness. And yes, we all want to avoid hell. That's the whole point of hell, is a very, very terrible thing that puts this desire inside of us to stay away from it. But that takes choosing heaven over earth on a daily basis. And so ask yourself, what is it inside of me that I think God could never use me because of that? This thing that I struggle with, this thing that I think is broken, this thing that I think I cannot overcome, it's not a mistake that that's who you are. It's that exact thing that God wants to use to not only deliver you in your own life, but all the other lives that are affected by yours. So let's talk about Gideon. So Gideon, I kind of struggled with exactly what his issue was, because my first few read-throughs of Judges 6 and 7, I saw Gideon as someone who doubted God. I saw him as somebody who got asked to do a thing and be given an opportunity, and he doubted that God could do for him, or that he could do for God what he was being asked to do. But actually, I think Gideon is simply afraid. And the instance that the Lord finds him in, he is in hiding. And so it makes sense that he would be, because they've got this enemy who's coming in and trying to steal everything good in their life. And so what we often do is to try to keep the enemy from stealing things in our lives is we'll hide. But what we don't understand is when we do that and we isolate ourselves from all the support around us, not only are we hiding from the enemy, but we're hiding from God. If we're running in a fearful mindset away from our responsibilities or away from our circumstances, and we're not choosing to actually take them on, then we're playing into the enemy's hand. So we're going to start in chapter 6, verse 25. That same night, the Lord said to him, "Take the second bull from your father's herd, the one 7 years old, tear down your father's altar to Baal, and cut down the Asherah pole beside it." Now, the first thing I want to point out is it's that same night. I want to kind of highlight the immediacy of the call of God, because as soon as the Lord finds Gideon where he's at, and he gives him this assignment, and he tells him what he's going to do with him, what he's going to ask from him, he immediately calls him to action. There wasn't a downtime. There wasn't time for Gideon to overthink this and think himself out of it. God called him to action immediately. And second of all, he has him start working at home. He tells him that he needs him to go out and cut down these 2 idols that his father has on his property. Apply that to our life. We very often, when we feel this call of God, when we feel this purpose on our life, we want to run out and start changing the whole world. We want to talk to other people's hearts. We want to talk to other people's problems. And God's saying, start at home first. You've got these own issues in your life. So these idols that his father had put up to Baal and Ashereth, they were very common idols that a lot of people fell into. And it wasn't that they stopped worshiping. Israel hadn't stopped worshiping God. They hadn't stopped acknowledging him as their deliverer who brought them out of Egypt. They had just added other idols into their worship. Have you ever done that? Do we ever do that? Do we ever come to church on Sunday and on Wednesday or whatever time you attend services and you worship God? You do that. And then you leave and you find other forms of idolatry to add into your life too. Sometimes we don't even notice it. Sometimes they sneak in there, and that's what the devil is so good at, is introducing idolatry into our life, and we don't even know it. Our hearts are already ready to do that. Our hearts are fallen. Our flesh is broken. We're looking for other things to worship other than God. But when God starts calling you out of that, the first thing he's going to do is the first thing he told Gideon to do. Get rid of the other idols. And they weren't even his. They were his father's. But they were in the house that he lived. This is a thing that I struggle with all the time. I'll give my life to Jesus, and then I'll try to take it back. I'll give my heart, I'll give my plan, I'll give my desires, I'll give my future, and then tomorrow I'll wake up in a different mood, and I'll try to take it back. We have to be in this current assessment of where our hearts are. The next verse. The Lord tells Gideon, then build a proper kind of altar to the Lord your God on top of this height. Using the wood of the Asherah pole that you cut down, offer the second bull as a burnt offering. Okay, so he tells Gideon, get rid of the idols. Get rid of the idols on your father's property. But he doesn't stop there. He doesn't tell him that he can just walk away. He's gotten rid of what needs to be gotten rid of. Now there's an empty space. And Jesus talks about this in the New Testament when he says, when an evil spirit leaves a house and it goes out seeking, if it comes back to find that house empty, it's bringing some of his friends. The same thing happens here. He tells Gideon, get rid of these idols, but then build an altar to worship me. You've got to replace the empty space that you just opened up. You've got to have something to put in it. I do this so often in my life. I will get rid of a bad habit. I'll get rid of a bad toxic mindset. I'll get rid of a bad perspective on life, and then I'll leave it open. But I have so many years of experience with that certain type of mindset that when it comes back, I'm better at it the second time than I was the first time. I have to replace what's been emptied with something pure and positive to fill it back up. Verse 27, so Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord told him. But because he was afraid of his family and the townspeople, he did it at night rather than in the daytime. So we see Gideon doing what the Lord asked him to do, but he's doing it at night because he's afraid of what the townspeople are going to say. He's afraid of the blowback when he tears down these idols that everyone's been worshiping. He knows that their response is not going to be a good one. And guess what? It wasn't. They wake up the next morning. I'll kind of summarize the next few verses. The people come out and they see their beloved idols to Ashereth and to Baal. They see them gone. There's a little bit of questioning. There's a little bit of investigation. And eventually they find out Gideon's done this. And so the first thing they try to do is they try to take his life. They all kind of mob up together and they say, okay, we're going to kill him. And Gideon's father, the very man who had erected these idols in the first place, he comes to his defense and he says, if this God Baal is so powerful, if he is the mighty God that you say he is, does he really need you to defend him against Gideon? And so what the people try to do after that is they name him, they give him a new name. It's called Jerubbaal, which basically means someone who opposes Baal. when you begin to change your life, when you begin on a new direction, the calling that God has for you, when you begin to believe what he says that you are, the world is always going to do those two things. First, they're going to try to just shut you down immediately. The devil will use the world to eliminate your purpose as fast as he can. Just like the people in these towns, they just tried to kill Gideon to be done with him. Well, they couldn't do that. So the next thing they did is they renamed him. The world will also do this to you. God will call you things like beloved. God will call you things like chosen. God will call you things like mighty. And then the world will immediately come behind and rename you. We were at dinner the other night. Anna and I were sitting beside this lady, and I have no idea what they were talking about. But she was referencing somebody they knew, and she said, if she can't control their actions, she'll rename them and try to control their identity. Now, I don't know who she was, but it sounds like she was certainly getting used by the enemy. Every time every bad thing is just a good thing corrupted. This thing, if it wasn't wrong, it's not incorrect. Gideon was someone who opposed Baal, but even if he would have assumed that identity, Baal's not who Gideon was supposed to be fighting. God had called Gideon to fight the Midianites. If he could have very well stepped into that and said, you know what? I am going to oppose Baal. I am going to tear down these idols to him. And then he gets totally sidetracked from the mission that God actually had him on. And it wasn't a bad sidetrack. It was a very good thing to tear down idols that oppose the Lord. But that's not the primary purpose that the Lord had called him to. That's the slick tactics of the enemy, to not necessarily get us with a lie, but to get us with a truth that isn't fully there. Verse 32. So because Gideon broke down Baal's altar, they gave him the name Jerubbaal that day, saying, let Baal contend with him. Now verse 34, it says, then the Spirit of the Lord took possession of Gideon. Then the Spirit of the Lord took possession of Gideon. So up to this point, all Gideon had was the word of the Lord. It wasn't until he actually began taking steps of obedience. It wasn't until he actually started to do what the Lord and got rid of the idols in his own heart. That's when God put his Spirit on Gideon. Now, we're in a different situation because we have God's Spirit inside of us. But I can speak from my own life that there have been times that I've been taking steps of obedience that I didn't necessarily feel like doing. It didn't feel like the Spirit of the Lord was on me, and he was still asking me to do the things that he asked me to do. Gideon had to take a few steps of obedience before the Lord actually put his Spirit on him. This is hard, though. This is difficult to do because what we often want is for God to part the Red Sea and then for us to step into it. When he told Moses to part the Red Sea, it wasn't until after Moses stepped up to it with his staff, made the motion with his arm, then the waters parted. Is God asking you to do something? You're waiting right now for signs and doors to be opened, but you have God's word. He's made you promises. He's told you things that are going to come to pass, and you're waiting for him to give you further proof, and he's waiting for you to move. If we begin taking steps in the new, all right, look, there's a great story in the New Testament. Jesus encounters this man in the temple, and this is Mark 3, verse 5. And the man has a withered hand. And he's in the temple, and Jesus knows that it's not that he's not supposed to be there, but he knows that he's getting looked at a certain way because he is there. And so Jesus calls him, and he asks him to do a thing that he's never done before. He says, stretch out your hand. Now, this man's hand wasn't healed when Jesus told him to do that. As a matter of fact, this man's hand began to heal when he began doing the thing that Jesus asked him to do. We live in this constant state of being afraid. We're afraid of outcomes. We're afraid that there will be a lack of provision. We're afraid that God won't meet us the place he's calling us to. And then as soon as we take that first step, as soon as our hand begins to open, as soon as we stretch it just a little bit, he will meet us in that moment. He will show us that he's going to do what he said he's going to do if we're just willing to be available. That's the greatest ability you can have, is availability. You do not have to be gifted and talented and poured upon with favor if you'll just show up. If you'll just have a heart of willingness and a spirit of obedience, God will do things with you that you never thought were possible. Verse 36. Gideon said to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand, as you have promised." So, this is the first time that Gideon approaches God and says, I need you to do something for me. I hear what you said. I know what needs to be done. I see my people being oppressed. I know there's an issue here. I'm a little surprised you're talking to me about it, but it's clear. If you're going to use me to rescue Israel, prove it to me in this way. And then he asked God for a very ridiculous type of proof. He asked God to do something that I don't think I could have ever thought of, but if you just want to envision this is probably much bigger than it actually was, but a fleece was just basically a rug or a towel made out of wolfskin. And he said, okay, God, if what you said is true, if I'm really this mighty warrior, if you're really going to use me like you say you're going to, then tonight I want you to make all the grass around it wet, but it dry. I want you to keep all of the moisture off of this thing and then prove that it should have been wet by everything around it being wet. And God says, okay. One of my favorite verses that I've ever come across, and it was during this study, and it's kind of funny sometimes I'll have like my specific Bible verses, like John 16:33 I consider my life verse, and then anytime I hear somebody else using it, I'm like, that's my verse. Like, God wrote that for me. Well, this is another one of them, because in verse 40 it says, that night God did so. That night God did so. What a ridiculous request, because he did it twice. Look, Gideon wakes up, sure enough, I can just imagine him like, okay, oh man, like so disappointed. I think he tried to think of something that God couldn't do, like that was just so ridiculous, and it's dry. And he says, okay, he says something like, don't be mad at me, but I got one more favor to ask. But you got to know, if that's me and God does the first one, then the second one, I'm just stalling and trying to buy time. Because if God does the first one, guess what he's going to do? He's going to do the second one. So he says, okay, God, do the opposite. I want just the fleece to be wet and nothing else to be wet. Everything else dry. That night, God did so. We'll skip ahead a little bit here. I just want to give you a number, because through chapter 6 and chapter 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times. 8 times without Gideon asking, God says something along the lines of, you're not going to die. I am going to use you. I am going to meet you there. Everything is going to work out the way that I said it will. Everything I've promised you, I am going to deliver on. 8 times God does that. And Gideon continues to come back and need more. Well, guess what God does to that need? He meets it every time. Fearful obedience is still obedience. If you're afraid of what God's asking you to do, it doesn't matter as long as you still do it. That's the beautiful thing about Gideon in this entire story, is he never stops moving. He says a lot of stuff to God. He says a lot of crazy stuff. He asks a lot of weird favors. He does a lot that we look at and say, you could have done better. But guess what he never says? He never says no. Not one time does he tell God, I'm not going. Several times he says, I will, but can you? And God says, yeah. God did so. And then God says, I met you where you were. Now I need you to meet me where I am. chapter 7, verse 2. The Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. My own strength has saved me." So at this point, Gideon has 32,000 soldiers. When the Spirit of the Lord falls on him, he goes out, he blows the ram's horn. It's a call to arms to all the people in the area, and 32,000 show up. Now, that's not nearly as many as the Midianites had, but that's still a pretty formidable army. And if I'm Gideon, I'm thinking, okay, this is looking like, I'm not totally the mighty man of valor yet. Like, I'm not sure that this is going to happen, but God's meeting me because I just blew this ram horn and 32K showed up. So I'm starting to believe that maybe this is possible. And then God comes along and says, all right, we got a little bit of a problem. You got too many people. Look, think about this in your own life. Because sometimes we begin to lose things. As Pastor Jeremy referenced earlier, every loss can be a lesson. But we're losing things because we didn't participate in the sacrifice of them in the first place. If Gideon would have kind of bucked against God here and said, hey, I think I've got just enough, man. God gave him an opportunity to be obedient in the process. God was giving him a chance to participate in his plan. This just happened to me this past week. I was telling Cole and Brooks about it at the house. I had prayed for a very specific thing. Very specific thing. With just the slightest bit of expectation that God would deliver. And the very next day, not even 24 hours later, God delivered in such a specific, I can't not believe in this stuff anymore, because God will just take this thing that seems so random and unimportant, and he will put his hand on it just so that I know that it's him. But the crazy thing that I realized as I was talking to them is that blessing that I prayed for and God delivered on, he probably would have delivered if I wouldn't have prayed for it. It may have just shown up in my life, and I'd have just been like, what a tremendous blessing. Thank you, God. But what he did was give me the opportunity to ask for it so that then I could realize that I was part of this and that he does answer prayers, because what that's going to do is encourage me to pray for these random specific things in the future. Guess what? They were probably on their way anyway. But now I get to walk alongside God, and I get to be a partner in this, because that's what prayer is. Prayer is a partnership between me and him. And when he gives us those chances, even when it sounds like you've got too many soldiers, if you're walking through your life and you're seeing things fall away that you thought you needed, like 22,000 men, God often wants to bring us to a place where we can know, we have to know that it was him. We have to know. He has to prune away all of our human efforts and all of our human abilities and all these provisions that we give ourselves, that we work so hard to pile up. God says, no, you got to get rid of that. Because if you don't, when you win, when you overcome, when I give you the thing I'm going to say I'm going to give you, you're going to think you did it. God's got to know that we know that it's him. He's got to be able to trust us with the ability that every time he drops the blessing in our life, the first thing we do is say, okay, it's yours though. It's yours. I appreciate it. I love it. I'm going to do my best to take care of it, but it's yours, and I'll never forget that you're the one who gave it to me. So here's how he gets rid of 22,000 men. He says, if you're scared, go home. If you're scared, go home. 32K and 22,000 of them say, you know what, I'm out. Thank you. I've been waiting for somebody to say. And just a few minutes ago upstairs, I realized Gideon could have been one of them that walked away. This whole story is different because guess what? Gideon was scared. Almost every verse we're highlighting today is Gideon saying, I'm afraid. I'm afraid, but I'm here. I'm afraid, but I'm here. That's not a mistake. It's not a mistake that God calls a man hiding in a wine press because of fear. And he says, I'm going to highlight your fear because through me you can overcome it. And not only can you overcome it, you can go all the way to the other side of it and be the thing that I've called you. I saw this really interesting thing that I wish I could have done more research on, and I don't even know if I can pronounce it. It's a Japanese art form. It's called kintsugi, Kintsugi. And they take very, very expensive, rare artifacts, dishes, vases, whatever, that are broken. And they take them and they repair them and they mend them back together, and they use gold to seal them, to repair them. And so once it's done, if it were just a plate, now it's a plate with all these golden cracks in it. It highlights the brokenness with something that is valuable. That's what God is going to do in your life if you will let him. These things that you call broken, that you're ashamed of, that you're trying to hide in a wine press, he's going to say, not only is that okay, but that's the very thing I'm going to use to impact other people's lives and make you believe in me. Like, know that I'm real because I take your garbage and it's the thing that you're most proud of. So 22,000 men go home. And I can't blame them. That going to war with these people who have been oppressing you, and not only that, but you look and you see that they're more than you. And you also look and you see that your own folk are running back home. That's not really a sandbox most of us would play in. Like, we're going home too, right? So they do. But 10,000 stay. And that's okay. If I'm Gideon, and when Pastor Jeremy and I were talking a couple weeks ago about this series, it's okay if you leave, because I don't want to go to war with people who don't want to fight. I want, when I'm doing these enormous things that God is calling us to do, if you're scared, I want you to go. If you don't want to be there, I don't want you to be there either, because at some point, you become a liability. These men, these 22,000 men, if this doesn't happen and he goes to war with them, I wouldn't expect that the results turn out the same as they do, as we see here in a minute. The same goes for your life. You're in a war that the devil is trying to, at the very least, stop you from doing what God's called you to do. And at the very most, end your life. I want to know that the people walking alongside of me, the people fighting with me, are actually doing just that, walking alongside me and fighting, because if they're not, they're a liability. If they're not, they're distracting me. If they're not, they're calling me Jerubbaal, or they're not fighting the same battle that I'm fighting. He needed these guys to leave. So, Gideon looks around and he says, great, I'm down to 10,000. I appreciate it, God. I don't really understand what you're doing, but it feels like things are getting worse before they get better. But you know what? 10,000 is still a pretty good number, and I believed you because of the fleece thing. Like, that was crazy that you did that, so let's just go. Cool. And God says, actually, you still got too many. You still got too many people. 10,000, because let's be honest, if I go to war with 32,000 people, and I win, and I think that was because of me, I would probably feel the same way if it's 10,000 people. It's still a lot. You still got a lot of people fighting by your side, and you could still say, we were some mighty warriors, and that's why we overcame this. Like, 10,000 is... And so God says, you still got too many, man. And Gideon says, okay, so what would you like me to do? And he says, take them down to the water. And when you take them down to the water, all of the people are going to drink one of two ways. All of your soldiers will either get on their knees and put their face right in the water, and they'll drink that way. Or they're going to put their hands down, they're going to scoop water up, and they're going to drink out of their hands. And that once you see that, once that distinction is made, I'll tell you who to keep and I'll tell you who to send home. And he says, okay. 9,700 people did the kneeling down and drinking out of the water. 300 drank out of their hands. And of course, because God is who he is, he said, the 300, that's who you got. Send everybody else home. I don't really know what would be going through my mind at this point. I think, honestly, I would be like, all right, man, like I'm this far in. At the very least, if I go to war with, I don't know if Gideon was 301 or what, but I die this way. That's one way to go out. I'm not gonna not. I've gotten this far. I'm gonna keep going. But you should take this into account in your own life, because only 300 people out of the initial 32,000 were doing the thing that God needed them to be doing to use them the way he wanted to use them. And so I say that because if you're looking around in your walk, in your kingdom building, in your gospel sharing, and everybody else is doing it the way you're doing it, you might not be doing it the right way. These numbers right here say that even if we go down to the 10,000, only 3% were doing what God needed them to be doing. Now, I don't know if I'm sure there's some symbolism and there's something about them kneeling down. Maybe that's because they worshiped idols, or something about if they're standing up, it meant they could look around and be aware and pray. I don't know. But what I know is very few were the ones God called. Very few were doing the thing God says, that's what I'm going to use for the victory that I'm about to give you. So if you're doing things different than most people are doing them, that's probably a good sign that you're doing them right. Verse 8, so Gideon sent the rest of the Israelites home, but kept the 300, who took over the provisions and trumpets of the others. Don't miss that. They took over the provisions that all the guys who were going home had. When you're all in, when you're a part of the minority who's so sold out that you look around and it might be 3% of you, expect an abundance of blessing. Because all this stuff that God is so ready to give everybody who will follow him, once they start falling off, guess who gets it? His kingdom. It's going towards kingdom building. And so if you're a part of that kingdom, you're a part of that building too. Verse 10. God meets Gideon before Gideon can be Gideon. He says, if you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant. He knew he was afraid to attack. Gideon had admitted time and time again, I'm afraid. I need you to do this because I'm afraid. So one last time, God beats him to it. And he says, I know you. Some of the most beautiful moments of my personal walk is when I felt God say, I know you. I know where you are right now. I see what you're going through. I know what you're feeling. And he meets me there. He meets me there with provision and blessing and reassurance before I can even ask for it. Every time I do this, every time I get the chance to do this, I always want to make a point to talk about how this is gospel. Because look, we're in Judges, and we're talking about Gideon, but every message that comes out of this pulpit or any pulpit that's ever preached out of should be the gospel of Jesus Christ in one way or another. This is it. Being met where you are, God coming to it and saying, I know this is where you're at, and I'm going to be here before you're there so that when you get there, I'm going to meet you. I know you're scared, Gideon. I don't even have to ask you. I know you are, so I've got something planned for you. I've got something to reassure you. That's what this gospel message is, and it should be how we're sharing it. Because look, I'm not the only one who's supposed to be preaching the gospel. Pastor Jeremy is not the only one who's supposed to be preaching the gospel. If you've accepted Jesus into your life, it's now your number one responsibility to be a preacher of the gospel. Whether or not God ever calls you up on a stage in a pulpit, that's between you and God. But guess what? I encounter way more people out here than I do like this right here. We've got to be ready. We've got to be ready. We've got to be willing. And guess what? If you're scared, it's okay. If I'm a non-believer and I have a believer come to me and they portray that they've got everything together, I know that's a bridge too far. I know I can never get to where you are because you're already holy and perfect. Us going out in our brokenness, us going out in our struggles, us being transparent about the things that we think separate us from God, that allows other people to cut down on that separation. They get to see God using imperfect people, and that gives them the chance to believe that they can be one too. Don't worry about people thinking if you're perfect or not, because one, you're not, and two, they need to see that you're not. Okay. So he sends him to the camp. Sends him right into the thing that he's scared of. That's probably happened for you, and if it hasn't, it's going to happen for you. The very thing that you fear, God is going to plant your deliverance right in the middle of it. Gideon is scared of the Midianite army. He's scared that he's not going to be able to defeat them. He's afraid he's going to lose his life. He's afraid God's not going to meet them there. And the very vehicle that God provides for him to overcome that fear is in the Midianite camp. He says, I'm going to send you into enemy territory for you to get the deliverance from this fear that you need. And that's exactly what happens. He goes down, he takes his servant with him. They get to the outskirts of the camp, just close enough that they can overhear a conversation. And it's two Midian soldiers. And one of them is explaining a dream to the other. And he says, I had a dream that this, I think it's barley loaf, rolls down the hill into the Midianite camp and it crushes the tent. It sounds a little kind of random, but the guy that he's talking to says, this surely must mean that Gideon and his soldiers are going to defeat us. It's got to mean that. It can't mean anything else. Imagine if you could hear what the enemy is actually saying about you. Imagine if you could understand that hell fears you way more than you fear hell. If you need evidence, just look at how hard the devil fights to distract you from your purpose, to convince you that you're not who God says that you are, to tempt you with things that are going to derail your path. The enemy's scared of you. And if we could get that glimpse of the real conversation of who we're fighting, when they're saying, you know what, they are going to beat us. They are going to overcome this. They are going to put us in our place. It would change our whole perspective. It would change our whole walk. It would change our whole approach to life if we knew that the enemy was more scared of us than we are of them. That's what Gideon found out. They've got 32,000, I don't even know how many the Midianites had. It was way more than 300. And they're sitting around talking about how Gideon and his soldiers are going to win. And that's what Gideon needed to hear. Have you ever done that? Have you ever told somebody something, a fact, or a thing that you believe, or an idea, and you tell them over and over, maybe 3 or 4 times, and they just never really buy into it, and then the moment they hear it from somebody else, they're like, oh, hey, did you know that? And you're like, I've been telling you that. God had told Gideon so many times, I'm with you. You're going to win. We've got this. I'm going to use you. You're a mighty man of valor. And Gideon's like, okay. And then the second he hears it out of a human's mouth, he believes it. And it changes him. It changes his whole approach. The first thing he does is he falls down and he worships. Verse 15 says, when Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he bowed down and worshipped. He returned to camp of Israel and called out, get up, the Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands. I can just imagine God looking down and seeing him after he hears it from another soldier's mouth, and now Gideon's like, hey, we're going to win, and God's like, I've been telling you that. I've been telling you. But he did. He believed it. And he worshiped before the war. Before he ever actually went and fought the fight, before he ever engaged in battle, he worshiped God. Do we do that? Do I do that? When God tells me a thing, when he tells me who I am and he tells me how he's going to use me, is my first instinct to fall down and worship and thank him for the thing that he hasn't actually yet done? He's just told me that he's going to. That's the weapons of our warfare. Because look, Here's what they actually gave him. He says, verse 16, it says, dividing the 300 men into 3 companies, he placed trumpets and empty jars in all of the soldiers' hands. If I'm going to war and somebody hands me a trumpet and an empty jar, I'm going to think we've got 2 different definitions of war. But that applies to us. Our weapons, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. So why do we think that we would fight the heavenly battles, the spiritual battles, the same way we fight the physical battles? I'll get so worked up physically. I'll get so emotional. I'll get so mentally charged thinking, this is how I win. This is what I do. This is what I do. And God says, just worship me. Just thank me for what I said I was going to do, because guess what? I'm going to do it, and you don't have to wear yourself out trying to do it yourself if you'll just trust me. I get the feeling that the 300 men, what they actually were, are the men who, when they got handed a trumpet and a torch, they said, yeah, this is it. This is what we need. I don't understand it, but this just feels right. I bet none of them were saying, hey, where's our knives at? Where are the weapons at? No, these guys got it. That's why there were only 300 of them. God will continue in our lives to bring the battle from the physical into the spiritual, if we let him, because that's where he has already called us to live. Is when Jesus was tempted in the wilderness, all 3 times that the devil tempted him with something, it was a physical temptation. It was either his health, jumping off the temple, it was everything, the kingdoms of the world, all this physical stuff. And all 3 times, Jesus confronted him by bringing it back into the spiritual, because that's where he knew he had victory, was in the spiritual and not the physical. We've got to keep our mindset in the same place, because we're not always going to feel in the physical like we're going to win this thing. Every day we go through struggle. Every day we go through a battle of our minds and a battle of our flesh where we think, God, I know you said that. I know you made these promises to me, but there will always be the provision necessary if God makes the promise. Even if you don't understand the provision, I love it when God when he fulfills a promise, and then there are all these other elements and components that when he was telling the children of Israel, you get to the promised land, I'm going to have milk and honey there. I'm sure they thought, great, those both sound very delicious. But what they found out when they got there were all the other promises baked right into that recipe. If you've got milk, you've got cows. If you've got cows, you've got meat. If you've got cows, you've got grass. If you've got grass, you've got nice weather. If you've got honey, you've got bees. If you've got bees, you've got a whole ecosystem. They saw the milk and the honey. And then they got there, and God said, yeah, and here's everything that's required for those 2 to be true. God promises you that you're beloved. He promises you a hope and a future. Guess what? There's way more entailed in those things than just a name and an idea. All the things that are necessary for you to fulfill the promises and the call that God has on your life, that's the real blessing. That's the thing where if he explained the whole vast majority of it, we might talk ourselves right out of believing it. Because I can probably believe in milk and honey, because that's just 2 things. But if you ask me to believe in all of the things that are required for those to be present and accurate, ooh, that's a lot, God. I don't know about that. So he says, you just buy into the big thing, and then I'll show you the small things along the way. All right, here's how we're going to conclude. Verse 17. Gideon's got his men, and he's got his orders from God, and he's got the proof. He's got the proof that he needed. He's got what he needed to overcome the thing that was crippling him, the thing that had him doing the wheat stuff in the place that the wheat stuff was never supposed to. He was afraid. And God planted the remedy for his fear right in the place that he was afraid of. So he's got it, and he knows we are about to win this thing. And here's what he says. He's addressing his soldiers and he says, watch me. Follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. We're not even a whole chapter away from him saying, pardon me, my Lord, how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family. He goes from a laundry list of excuses why he can't be the man that God's calling him to be, to telling all the soldiers, y'all just watch me and do what I do. What a turnaround. What a change. What an evolution. What a construction of purpose. Just like that. Just like that. He never stopped moving towards the place God was calling him to. Yes, with every step, he was saying, I'm afraid. I'm afraid. And God says, all right, man, I got you. Just keep going. He's like, all right, but I'm afraid. I'm still afraid. You're taking all my men. You're taking all our weapons. I don't know what to do. Look how many, it says they looked down over the camp, and they couldn't even count the number of camels, and the number of people were like locusts. And he's got 300 guys back at camp, and they got torches and trumpets. And God says, just keep moving, man. Just keep moving. And so all of a sudden he does, and he finally arrives to the place of his identity. And he says, okay, you're right. Look where I'm at. Look where I'm at. Look where you've brought me. Look at this thing I feel inside of me. Look what I now know. I now know that you're going to do what you said you were going to do. I've believed it, but the fear has kept me from fully buying in. And now I walk in the knowledge of you delivering on your promises. And the way that God did that for him is the way that you will often see God do that for you. And that is by removing you from the situation and seeing how God is using you in the building of his kingdom. There's a really cool story about our space race. When we were in competition way back in the 60s with Russia, earlier than that really, trying to get to the moon. We wanted to be the first people, everybody across the world, when technology began to develop that could get us off this planet, we wanted to get to the next closest thing we could see. And we did. In 69 was the first time that astronauts actually got to the moon, walked on the moon, did the whole process. And it was really cool because we got where we were trying to go. But if you read an interview with Buzz Aldrin, he says that the most fascinating and mind-blowing part of it was not stepping on the moon, but was once they got away from Earth to be able to turn back and look and see. Because before anybody had gotten above the atmosphere of this planet, nobody knew what this looked like. We had been trapped on this rock, and so we could see what it looks like in front of our face, and we could see what we were walking on, but we never elevated far enough to really get a full picture of it. And then the astronauts did, and they got to the moon, and they got to turn around once they left their own little world and see what it looked like from another perspective. When you feel God start pulling you out of yourself, when you feel God bringing you to a place that is no longer really about you, you're going to get a real good picture of who you are. Because up to that point, you're so blinded and your understanding of yourself is so polluted with yourself that until you see the 300 men saying, we'll go to war with you, we will fight for you, and we will die for you, that's when Gideon realized, I am a mighty man of valor. And it's because he saw it in the reflection of the men who were following him. Do not resist when God starts pulling you out of yourself. My goodness, is it uncomfortable. Can you imagine getting in a spaceship and shooting off of this planet? That couldn't have been comfortable at all. That was probably the scariest experience any of us would ever feel. But to get to do that and turn around and see this thing that they just came off of, that they spent their whole life, God's going to use other people to show you who you are. So as we've gotten to this point, I've said some things that hopefully you've related to. The enemy is currently and constantly trying to steal those fruits of your labor. He's trying to take all of these things that are being produced in your life. He might not have you in bondage. He might not have you in oppression. You might be living your life fairly comfortably. But is he stealing your fruit? Do you see the produce of your blessings? Because if not, God's trying to use that thing that feels so broken to identify that so that you can overcome that enemy. And it's not a mistake that you are afraid. It's not a mistake that you have control issues. It's not a mistake that you're uncertain of your identity. That's the vehicle God will use to deliver you. And don't be surprised when he plants that deliverance right in the place that you're most afraid of, just like he did Gideon. Here's how the story ends. Verse 22. When the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. They didn't even have to fight. Gideon and his men did not even have to raise a hand, lay a finger on any of these Midianites for them to win this battle. They killed themselves. The things with the trumpet and the torches was so confusing and so out of left field. It was so unexpected that they just went crazy and started killing each other. The battle is the Lord's. Hear me when I say that. The battle you're fighting right now is the Lord's. Is he going to call you to come alongside him? Yes. Do you have to be the one that actually does the fighting? No. 2 weeks ago, I was in Nashville, and I was at my cardiologist, and they were doing some very brief tests just to kind of check out and see how I was. While I was waiting to see the doctor, I went to the cardiac ICU, and it's kind of strange that anybody can just walk in there, considering how kind of fragile a lot of the healths of those people are. But they do. You can just walk in. And I did. And I walked in, and I remembered the exact room that I was in because I was there for so long, and I was so traumatized by what happened to me there. And as I walked up and down that hallway, I just started praying for the people in each of the rooms. Now, I didn't know their names, and this is not me trying to sound holy. I was just, God help these people. But it's because I remembered I couldn't fight that battle. I could not lay there in a coma and plead my case to the creator of the universe. Somebody else was doing that for me. Somebody else was praying for me. I was the paralytic whose friends had to take them to Jesus because I couldn't get there myself. But guess what? I didn't have to. That wasn't my battle to fight. That was the Lord's battle. And he met me there. And he will meet you there today. Identify something in your life that the enemy is trying to take from you. And identify the quality inside of you that you're afraid that he's going to use to do that. Because those two will be correlated. They were stealing all their food and they were having to hide because they were afraid. And then God put his finger on that fear and he said, I'm going to use that to let you overcome that and show you that I'm the one in control of all of this. Does everybody receive that? All right, if you'll stand with me, I'm going to pray. God, thank you for today. Thank you for this room full of people. Thank you for this word. I pray that as it went out into the hearts, into the minds, into the lives, that it can do that in a spiritual way. This isn't just a physical practice. This isn't us just showing up to a building together, but this is us seeking you. And so we ask that the seeds that were planted will produce fruit and that lives will be changed. In Jesus' name, amen.
Can we give a